Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to be reading some history magazine articles. And the theme for these articles are expeditions that went terribly wrong in one way or another. These articles were chosen by my channel members. They were chosen by all the happy squirrels, Marta, and Miss Knit Whispers. Thank you, channel members. If you would like to become a channel member and pick future history magazine articles, you can click the join button right down there. Or if you're on mobile and there's no join button, you can click the very first link in the description box. My channel memberships are only 99 US cents, the lowest I can possibly make it, and you get a bunch of perks. Right now, channel members are going to get some behind the scenes on some big life changes that I'm going through. So if you want to be privy to all of that, plus get your name in every video, get little perks, audio only content, you can go ahead and join. I'd be happy to have you. But let's get into the articles. We're going to read about 3 explorers who set off on an adventure and it did not go as they had planned. We're going to read about Cabeza de Vaca, Percy Fawcett, and the Polaris expedition of Charles Francis Hall. So let's get into it. Starting with Cabeza de Vaca, explorer, survivor, historian. I think I need to get a better angle because I don't think you can see all of the article. Whoops, I almost dropped everything. That was terrifying. Can't see the bottom. There we go. Now we're good. Okay. Let's get into it. When a group of European colonists encountered 13 indigenous people in northern Mexico in 1536, they expected them to flee. Instead, the people walked toward them. Among the indigenous group were people who looked European, one of them speaking perfect Spanish. This man, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and 3 others accompanying him had spent nearly a decade living among indigenous peoples in the southwestern part of North America. They were survivors of a 600-strong colonial fleet. During their 8-year odyssey, Cabeza de Vaca turned the traditional conquest of the Americas upside down, from one of domination to one of cooperation and exchange. Colonial expeditions. Cabeza de Vaca, or cow's head in English, is a startling and unusual surname in Spanish, yet it is entirely fitting for the life and travels of Spaniard Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. He was born around 1488, a few years before Christopher Columbus first set eyes on what Europeans would call America. The son of a minor noble family, Cabeza de Vaca grew up in Jerez de la Frontera in southern Spain. Spain's recent colonial expansion in the Americas filled the nearby port of Cadiz with returning sailors with extraordinary tales of the strange new continent to the west. Later in his travelogue, La Relación, or the account, Cabeza de Vaca would recount his epic journey. In his youth, Cabeza de Vaca fought as a soldier in the wars in Italy and Spain. In his 30s, he turned away from military life and looked for an opportunity in the ongoing colonization of the Americas. In 1526, news circulated that a new expedition was being captained by Pánfilo de Narváez, rival of Hernán Cortés, who defeated the Aztecs in the conquest of Mexico. The Narváez had obtained a grant to conquer territory north of the Gulf of Mexico between modern-day Texas and Florida. He he formed a fleet of 5 ships with 600 men total, appointing Cabeza de Vaca as the expedition's treasurer, a senior position. The fleet, which also carried enslaved Africans, left Sanlúcar de Barrameda on Spain's southern coast on July 17, 1527. The expedition was racked with difficulties from the outset. Many sailors deserted, and a storm sank 2 ships off the southern coast of Cuba. The expedition continued its voyage to Florida, and in the spring of 1528, it finally reached Tampa Bay. In September, de Narvaez made a fateful decision to split the expedition in 2, encouraged by the promise of food and gold farther north in the Appalachia region. While the remaining ships would continue to search for a safe port, the rest of the men, about 300, would venture into Florida's interior in search of the promised riches. De Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca took the expedition inland into Florida, with 40 men on horseback and the rest on foot. Along the way, Cabeza de Vaca said they saw very large mountains and the trees wonderfully tall. But when they reached the supposedly rich Appalachia region, they discovered not riches, but only clusters of huts. Dwindling food stores, attacks by the Appalachia people, and decreasing numbers caused de Narvaez and his men to return to the coast. But they could not locate their ships. Instead, the party made 5 flimsy barges. Of the tails of horses we made ropes and tackles, and of our shirts sails. Cabeza de Vaca wrote, with nearly 50 men on each craft. The barges sat low in the water and were so crowded we were almost unable to stir. They skirted the coast of the west until they reached the mouth of the Mississippi. Strong currents dragged the vessels out to sea. De Narvaez's barge was swept away, while the one that Cabeza de Vaca and some 80 companions huddled on finally washed up on an island where they disembarked. And as it was then in November and very cold, we were in appearance the very image of death, he recounted. Slavery to fame. Cabeza de Vaca named the island the Isle of Misfortune. It's thought to be today's Galveston Island in Texas. There, the Europeans experienced complex interactions with indigenous people. In his Relación, Cabeza de Vaca described great acts of compassion from the inhabitants. They were brought food, despite great scarcity. Hunger and disease swept through, leaving just 15 Spaniards alive. On seeing their plight, the islanders expressed compassion. For more than half an hour they wept so loudly and so sincerely that it could be heard far away. Later, however, he wrote of cruelty endured from other indigenous islanders, and how he and his companions were forced into slavery. 6 years later, in 1534, Cabeza de Vaca and 3 others managed to escape, including an enslaved African named Esteban de Dorantes. They became itinerant traders, swapping items such as snail shells for hides and flints. This trade suited me well, for I was at liberty to go where I pleased, Cabeza de Vaca wrote. They treated me well and gave me things to eat and sought me out for my fame. Part of this fame rested on his reputation as a healer among the indigenous peoples. In his account, he was uncertain as to whether he genuinely believed he had such power, describing his cures as reckless and daring. For the following 2 years, the quartet, led by Cabeza de Vaca, took a route that headed west across the Sierra Madre and then down the Pacific coast of modern-day Mexico in search of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. In his Relación, Cabeza de Vaca names over 20 different indigenous peoples that he encountered, including the Avavares, with whom we stayed with for 8 months. The Avavares have since been identified as part of the hunter-gatherer Coahuiltecan culture that once inhabited southern Texas. Having survived on a diet of roots, wild herbs, and fruits, the group had all radically changed in appearance since setting out from Spain. Their hair and beards were long. Their near-naked bodies were covered in meager cloths and skins. Like snakes, we shed our hides twice a year, Cabeza de Vaca later wrote, and the sun and the air made us look as if we were naked. We received great pain because of the very heavy loads that we carried. In 1536, the travel-hardened group finally made contact with Europeans in northern Mexico. They were the first of many fascinated audiences Cabeza de Vaca and his companions would encounter. Later that summer, they arrived in Mexico City and were hailed as celebrities. The following year, Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spain and wrote La Relación, chronicling his encounters during his near decade in North America. The book was published in 1542 to enormous acclaim. Documented travels. Not only is La Relación an exciting chronicle of Cabeza de Vaca's survival in the American wilderness, it's also a valuable record of the peoples living across the American South at that time. Cabeza de Vaca documented more than 20 different indigenous cultures and recorded in great detail their clothes, rituals, homes, customs, and cuisines. Few other contemporary accounts of the Americas in this period expressed such sympathy and deep knowledge of indigenous peoples. Cabeza de Vaca sometimes mocked certain practices as superstitious, but the details of his overall documentation were respectful. He praised the technical abilities he saw, writing, "All the Indians from Florida we encountered were great archers. They shot their arrows with such force and precision." He later documented the unique mourning process for children. Of all the people in the world, they most love their children and treat them best. Bereaved parents, he wrote, cried thrice a day before dawn, at noon, and at dusk, followed by the whole tribe, day after day, for an entire year. The book reveals that Cabeza de Vaca's first encounter with the Spaniards near Culiacan, in modern Mexico's northwest, was not quite a joyous reunion. The Spaniards were engaged in capturing and enslaving indigenous people. Angered at their actions, Cabeza de Vaca secured promises from his compatriots that the indigenous people accompanying him would not be mistreated or enslaved. After we dispatched the Indians in peace, and with thanks for what they had gone through with and for us, the Christians sent us to a certain Alcalde Cerebros. He took us through uninhabited country to prevent our communicating with Indians. So we went on with the idea of ensuring the liberty of the Indians, and when we believed it to be assured, the opposite took place. The Spaniards had planned to fall upon the Indians, and that plan they carried out. Back to the Americas. After some time back in Spain, Cabeza de Vaca felt the pull of the Americas and longed to return. Despite the success of La Relación, he failed to be appointed governor of Florida. The Spanish king and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V gave the job to conquistador Hernando de Soto instead. Cabeza de Vaca languished for 3 years, until he was finally offered a post, the governorship of Rio de la Plata, a South American province comprised of parts of modern-day Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. After an arduous journey, Cabeza de Vaca's expedition arrived at Asunción, which is today's capital of Paraguay, in 1542. King Charles's policy was to expand Spanish conquests deeper into South America. Although Cabeza de Vaca had some success in expeditions to the west of the Paraguay River, he was more inclined to govern people than to conquer them. He entered into a hostile relationship with his predecessor, Domingo Martínez de Irala. Popular among his fellow colonialists, de Irala stirred up resentment among elites against Cabeza de Vaca, who was charged with professional incompetence. It had been noted that Cabeza de Vaca's attitude to indigenous peoples on his expeditions was conciliatory and diplomatic, methods at odds with more militant supremacists in the local military and civil administration. In 1545, Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spain for trial. He was found guilty of arrogance and incompetence and later sentenced to exile in North Africa. The harsh sentence was quashed on orders of the king, who granted clemency to the now elderly explorer. Cabeza de Vaca spent the last years of his life in his native Jerez de la Frontera, dying sometime between 1558 and 1564. In his later years, he revised and expanded his Relación into a much more extensive account called La Relación y Comentarios, which included a description of his time in Paraguay. Cabeza de Vaca's accounts are still startling for the richness of his observations. As he wrote to Charles V, I wished to present not merely a report of positions and distances, flora and fauna, but of the customs of the numerous native people I talked with and dwelt among, as well as any other matters I could hear of or observe. Interesting life, right? And then it talks about up here how he was one of the first Europeans to see Iguazu Falls, which would have been quite a sight when you didn't know you were stumbling upon one of the largest waterfalls in the world, right? Let's go on to adventures that ended much more tragically and also a bit more mysteriously. Next is Percy Fawcett and the tragic search for the lost city of Z. When the Spanish first ventured into the Amazon basin in the 1540s, they recorded indigenous accounts of a lost city of fantastic wealth that they called El Dorado, or the Golden. Over the centuries, many vain attempts were made to locate a lost civilization in the Amazon rainforest. The last significant attempt to find such a culture was undertaken by British explorer Percy Fawcett. Between 1906 and 1924, Fawcett made 7 expeditions across the Amazon basin, concluding with his doomed quest to find the city he called Z. Fawcett was inspired by his extensive reading of historical sources, including a mysterious document known as Manuscript 512. A man of extraordinary mental and physical stamina, Fawcett was working at a time when the Amazon region was still largely undocumented by Europeans who sought to explore its jungles and waterways, seeking ancient cities and riches. His disappearance during his search for Z in 1925 in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil continues to intrigue writers and filmmakers. Yearning to explore. Percy Harrison Fawcett was born in 1867 in Torquay, Devon. I don't know if that's how you say that, Torquay. In the English county that had produced many famous explorers and mariners, including Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. The son of an aristocrat who had lost his fortune, Fawcett described his childhood as lacking in affection. At age 19, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery and sent to outposts of the British Empire. In 1901, Fawcett joined the Royal Geographical Society of London and traveled to Africa as a surveyor in the service of the British state, tasked with gathering military intelligence. In 1906, he was commissioned by the Society to lead an expedition to the Amazon. Arriving in South America was the moment his whole life changed. Setting out from La Paz to map the vast territory on the borderlands of Bolivia and Brazil, Fawcett often faced hostility from indigenous peoples angered by rubber barons who had invaded their lands to extract rubber for use in car and train manufacturing. For nearly a decade, he roamed the Amazon basin, often the first European to record geographical features such as waterfalls. His writing gives a sense of the awe he experienced. Above us rose the Ricardo Franco Hills, flat-topped and mysterious, their flanks scarred by deep quebradas or ravines. They stood like a lost world, forested to their tops, and the imagination could picture the last vestiges of an age long vanished. The outbreak of World War I interrupted this rich period of exploration, forcing him to return to Europe. Although in his 50s, Fawcett was in peak physical condition, and he proved to be an outstanding soldier. A mysterious manuscript. Fawcett could not shake off the allure of South America, however. So when the war ended, he returned to Brazil, where he would pursue an idea that led him to his last great adventures and ultimately his mysterious death. Although Fawcett often relied on racist tropes and ideas when he wrote of Brazil's indigenous peoples, he also made great efforts to understand their customs and languages. He lamented the effects of colonialist greed on these societies and became convinced that Spanish and Portuguese accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries of complex civilizations in the rainforest may have had merit. Such accounts mention very large settlements as well as fine roadways in the interior. One document in particular fascinated Fawcett, known as Manuscript 512 and written in Portuguese. It is purportedly an account by adventurers and fortune hunters. In 1753, in search of precious metals, the adventurers found a ruined city boasting monumental buildings, roads, and a plaza, in each corner of which is a spire in the style of the Romans. Scholars are divided about the manuscript's authenticity. Skeptics consider it a forgery. Brazil achieved independence from Portugal in 1825. It would have been useful for a new and secure republic to discover a document that described ancient civilizations in its territory, akin to the great Maya sites in Central America. Many at the time, however, accepted the manuscript's authenticity, including Fawcett, already convinced that early accounts of complex civilizations in the rainforest were accurate. He became obsessed with finding such a place. Personally, I think that, sure, there could have very well been very large cities in the Amazon, but they're long gone now, and the Amazon has swallowed them up. So even if we find anything, it's all going to be super forested and impossible. That's my concept. There could have very well been something like that, but it's long gone now. In Search of Z. Although Fawcett was inspired by Manuscript 512's claims, he never intended to find the city it described. The settlement in that document lies supposedly in Brazil's northeast. Citing other sources, which he did not name, Fawcett became convinced that a lost civilization existed in the wild central western region of Mato Grosso. He named the city Z. In April 1925, Fawcett set out from Ceará to find it, accompanied by his eldest son Jack and his son's best friend, Raleigh Rimmel. The last news from them was in a letter Fawcett sent to his wife. "We shall disappear from civilization until next year. Imagine us in forests so far untrodden by civilized man." And then they really did disappear. Were they killed by animals or people? Several expeditions were launched in an attempt to clarify what happened, including one headed by Peter Fleming, brother of the James Bond creator Ian Fleming. Many of these ventures also ended in tragedy, and none shed any light on what happened to Fawcett. In 1952, anthropologist Orlando Villas-Boas announced he had found the bones of the explorer, and that Kalapalo Indians had confessed to killing him. Later forensic analysis showed the remains did not belong to Fawcett. Fawcett's story has had an enduring cultural impact. He is one of the inspirations for the character Indiana Jones. It notes that Walt Disney owns National Geographic. The English explorer was also the subject of David Grant's The Lost City of Z, A Tale of Deadly Obsession in the Amazon, the basis for a 2016 feature film. In his book, Grant quotes Kalapalo Indians who insist they had not killed Fawcett. They had seen the smoke from Fawcett's camp for a few days until it stopped. They say he likely died at the hands of hostile people in territory to the east. Although the mystery of his last days may never be fully resolved, Fawcett's quest for a lost city may be at an end. In the decades since the disappearance, exploration of northeastern Mato Grosso has uncovered the remains of large urban settlements, now located in Xingu Indigenous Park. Named Kuhikugu, the complex includes remnants of streets, bridges, and large squares. That's what I'm saying. Modern LiDAR scans further suggest that between 1500 and 400 years ago, this part of the Amazon was indeed the site of a large settlement. While Z's exact identity and location are still a mystery, Fawcett's hunch about a hidden ancient city in the region seems to have been correct. So yeah, I think in the Amazon and then also Guatemala most certainly had many, many cities that have been swallowed up by jungle and we'll probably never find. Let's read one more story. My eyes are getting so heavy. I'm getting so tired reading this. I hope you are too. Let's do one more. Arctic Murder Mystery, Voyage of the USS Polaris. Along with much of American and the British public in the mid-19th century, Charles Francis Hall was riveted by accounts of Sir John Franklin's tragic 1845 expedition in search of the Northwest Passage, the fabled Arctic sea route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The scale of the loss, 2 vessels and 129 men, and the mystery surrounding the fates of Franklin and his crew, prompted many expeditions that set out to discover the outcome of their story. Hall was a deeply eccentric man, perhaps the unlikeliest fellow to ever become an Arctic explorer, said Russell A. Potter, a professor at Rhode Island College. Hall had no more than a few years of education and lived a quiet life as a family man and modestly successful engraver and publisher in Cincinnati, Ohio. But his interest in Franklin's doomed quest turned into an obsession with the Arctic and a personal mission to find survivors. By the late 1850s, various expeditions had found bodies and relics from the Franklin crew, dimming hopes of finding anyone alive. Still, in 1860, the 39-year-old Hall left Ohio for the Arctic to see if there were any lives left to save. Hall undertook 2 trips to the Arctic during the 1860s. He found no survivors from the Franklin party, but he lived among the Inuit people for nearly 8 years and documented their culture more than anyone had before him. When he returned to Washington, D.C. in 1869, Hall had his sights set on going to the North Pole, which had replaced the Northwest Passage as the chief goal of Arctic explorers. Apart from the costs of finding the passage, many believed it could never be a viable commercial waterway. I just tried to blink to get some sleep out of my eyes, and that didn't work. It just made me drowsy. Okay. One more article. And then I'm going to bed. Hopefully I already sleep right now, but if not, let's continue the story. Apart from the costs of finding the passage, many believed it could never be a viable commercial waterway. Hall lobbied hard for his expedition, winning the backing of President Ulysses S. Grant. Congress authorized $50,000 for the voyage, making it the first Arctic exploration entirely funded by the federal government. A screw-propelled steamer used by the Union side of the Civil War was retrofitted for the Arctic ice. The hull was reinforced with oak, and the bow sheathed in iron. Renamed USS Polaris, it set sail from New York on June 29, 1871, with 25 crew members, among them Inuit guides, Ipirvik and his wife. My eyes are way too tired to try to read Inuit names. Taquiltuk, Takotuk, as well as their infant son. In Greenland, I'm falling asleep. Inuk guide and hunter Hans Hendrik and his family joined the crew. Power struggles. Hall knew how to survive in the Arctic, but not how to run a full-fledged expedition. He was a commander with no military or naval rank, and a captain with no navigational experience. In the end, Sidney O. Buddington acted as navigator, with George E. Tyson assistant navigator. The vessel's command was split 3 ways. Another source of division soon materialized in the form of a German scientific team also on board, led by scientist and surgeon Emil Bessels. He was a 24-year-old graduate of the University of Heidelberg's medical school at 18. Wow. Bessels and the Germans held little respect for the uneducated Hall. After a month of sailing, tension and conflicts were growing. As Tyson would later write, some of the parties seem bound to go contrary anyway, and if Hall wants a thing done, that is just what they won't do. There are 2 parties already, if not 3, aboard. Meanwhile, the Polaris advanced, reaching latitude 82 degrees 29 north. Whatever. The first ship in history to sail that far north. That, however, would be as far as the ship would get. Turned back by ice in the Lincoln Sea, the Polaris put in for the winter in northwestern Greenland, a spot Hall called Thank God Harbor, about 500 miles south of the pole. On October 24, 1871, Hall returned from a 2-week sledge journey to the north. He drank a cup of coffee and became violently ill, with symptoms that included delirium and partial paralysis. Bessels diagnosed his condition as apoplexy, which is a stroke. Meanwhile, Hall insisted that Bessels was trying to poison him. He even banned the doctor from his bedside from October 29th until November 4th, during which time his condition improved. Hall then allowed Bessels to resume treatment. He seemed better, even taking a walk on deck, then suffered a relapse and died on November 8, 1871. His body was buried nearby. Buddington, now the ship's leader, had no interest in reaching the North Pole, calling it a damned fool's errand. Once the ice cleared, the ship headed south on August 12, 1872. 2 months later, when Polaris ran aground on a submerged iceberg, Buddington ordered cargo to be thrown onto the ice to buoy the ship. That night, 19 members of the expedition, including Tyson and all of the Inuit, were on the ice pack nearby when it suddenly ruptured. In the blackness of night, the ship broke free, leaving them stranded on the floe. Before long, the ship, with 14 crew members, including Buddington, and the party on the floe, lost contact. Cast adrift for more than 6 months, the group was rescued from the floe by a whaler off the coast of Labrador. Holy moly. If it were not for the Inuit among them who hunted from the floe's edge, they would not have survived. Meanwhile, the 14 survivors on the Polaris experienced their own odyssey. With coal stores running low, Buddington decided to run the ship aground near Etah, Greenland. The crew built a hut, and the local Inuit helped them survive the winter. The crew then built 2 boats out of wood from the Polaris and sailed south. They were rescued on June 23, 1873, by a whaler off Cape York. Murder and motives. The Navy held an inquiry into Charles Francis Hall's death, but with conflicting testimony and no body for an autopsy, no charges were made. Clearly, there was little incentive to add scandal to an already disastrous outcome. Nearly a century after Hall's death, Arctic historian Chauncey C. Loomis investigated the mystery, which he recounted in Weird and Tragic Shores, the story of Charles Francis Hall. In 1968, Loomis had Hall's body exhumed. Analysis revealed that he had received large doses of arsenic in the last 2 weeks before his death. Arsenic was common in medical kits at the time, but was never given in such quantities. Loomis considered Buddington, who dreaded the journey north, as a suspect. However, the arsenic had been administered to stimulate apoplexy, which Buddington would not know how to do. Loomis concluded that Bessels was the only one with the skill to murder Hall, but a clear motive was lacking. Bessels was openly dismissive of Hall, who returned the favor by calling him the little German dancing master. But Loomis's opinion was that personal dislike was too weak a motive for murder. Another piece of evidence emerged in 2015 when Russell Potter, the Rhode Island College professor, came across an envelope postmarked October 23, 1871, and addressed by Hall to a 24-year-old Miss Vinnie Bean. Bean? Yes. Ream? I'm getting so sleepy. Ream. Miss Vinnie Ream, a talented artist who had been commissioned to make a statue of Abraham Lincoln when she was 18. Before sailing on the Polaris, both Hall and Bessels socialized with Miss Ream in New York. Potter knew there had been correspondence between her and Bessels that suggests a romantic connection. Miss Ream also sent a bust of Lincoln to Hall, which he placed in his cabin on the Polaris. Potter theorizes that a love triangle might have been a third of Hall's death. The additional motive for Bessels makes the case a strong one, said Potter, but absent a time machine, I don't think it can ever be 100% resolved. What a story, right? He was murdered. It turns out he was actually murdered, which the next time I do History Magazine, I'm going to do famous murders, which this would have been in it, but I actually have lots of other articles about famous people who were murdered. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to go to bed. I don't know about you. I'm going to go to sleep. I hope that you found this video to be relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a good night. Good night.